All right, so we're going to talk about functions first. So what is a function? I know you guys have been working a lot with HTML and CSS previously, and now you're starting to look at JavaScript. But what is a function? A function is just a reusable chunk of code. Someone might liken it to a recipe. It's something where you can put certain things inside, and you'll get something out as a result. So we have an example with a baking recipe. So let's say you need to choose a flavor. You need to choose, you have a few options here. Maybe it's peanut butter, chocolate, or caramel. And the other thing you may want to do, is actually make the batter. You need to preheat the oven. And you need to add the cookies to a baking sheet. So we've got here is a recipe. So the recipe is, you can see from how it's written in this black box here, we've got a function called bake cookies. Now we could name this function really whatever we want to. We could name it cookie maker. We could call it recipe for cookies. We could call it cookie machine. Doesn't matter. So we can name that. What the parts of this that we can't decide is that first keyword function. That's a built-in JavaScript operator keyword. It's the function keyword. So that's what tells JavaScript that we're about to define a function. So we write the function keyword, and we call it bake cookies. After that, you see there's some parentheses. That's actually holding the input for this function. And we've defined two options. So we're basically defining what we're allowed to bring into our recipe. We're choosing a flavor, and we want to determine the number of servings. The next few lines inside these curly braces is actually the logic of the function, and it does several things. You see this var keyword. This is actually, we don't really use this keyword anymore in JavaScript, but this was an original JavaScript keyword. It stands for variable, and so you will see that sometimes. But for now, it's fine. So var is how we define our variables. So we have a flavoring, which we're setting equal to the variable that was passed in. We're defining a batter variable, which is being defined as our flavoring plus the servings. And we preheat the oven, and then we add the cookies to the sheet. So that's what's happening here. Then what we do is we have this function that's defined, and then we can actually invoke it. So you see there's 2 times below that we're actually calling our function. And this time, instead of just having a parameter, something that we're describing, that's describing the values, here we're actually passing in real values: chocolate, vanilla, the number of servings. That's the basic idea. So here's another example. We have a function where we add 4 numbers. So what are these 4 numbers? Again, we can name our variables whatever we want to, and here it's kind of generic because they're just numbers. So we have num1, num2, num3, num4, and we have a sum, and that sum is equal to those 4 numbers. And then we return the sum. What does it mean to return the sum? It means that the function has an output now. So these 4 variables were the input, and we have an output, which is what is being returned. So when you actually invoke a function, that's when you actually run it. So on the bottom line here, where it says add 4 numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, we are actually now running our function. The first part was the definition. The second part, we're actually running it. We can run it as many times as we want to with different numbers. And the equal sign, var my sum equals, is actually what is being returned from that function is being saved into my sum. So that's the basics of functions. But what's an object? So an object is a different kind of data type. So an object, so far you may have seen strings and numbers. They're called the primitive types. those are simple values. An object is a more complex type of data. It's more like an address book. It's an unordered collection of key value pairs. So an address book is actually also ordered by people's names. But let's say you had an address book that was not necessarily ordered by people's names. It was not in alphabetical order, but you wanted to look up someone's phone number. So you could find, if you search through that phone book, it might take you some time to find it if it's not ordered, but you would eventually find the person's name, and then you'd find a corresponding phone number. So that's exactly what an object does. Objects store values in string keys. The keys are like in the address book is like the person's name. So we have my object. We have 2 keys, which are strings, and the values. The values here also happen to be strings. They could be anything though. They could be numbers. They could be other objects. They could be Booleans. They could be they could technically be undefined, or they could be null. They could be functions. It could be anything in JavaScript that's a value. So here, in this case, the keys you see, they are strings. And you could also actually write it without the strings on the keys. So that's actually a JavaScript convention. You will actually see that the keys of an object are usually written, even though they're always strings, they're written without the quotation marks, generally. Here we're showing you with the quotation marks. Then line 10, we have a console log of my object accessing key 1. So when you access a key, you're going to get the value back. It's like you put in the key, you get back the value. You look up the address, the person's name in the address book, and you find their phone number. So when my object bracket key 1 is evaluates, it's going to turn into value 1. And when that's what you end up with in the console log. When you console log something, it means that you're outputting it to the terminal. Is that making sense to everyone? Any questions on anything I've said so far? Any comments? All right, sounds good. Oh, okay, all right, there we have an answer. Maybe, and this may be more advanced. You guys have already seen this. I'm not sure some of this. So just let me know if you want any more in-depth, have any deeper questions about these topics. Just let me know. So here's why are objects useful? Consider representing Pusheen the cat as an array. So an array is a good place to hold an unordered list of values, but it doesn't store any information about what those values represent, right? So we have here a cat named Pusheen, and I don't know whose cat that is or why her name is Pusheen. And it's not very useful to, if you're storing something in an array is good for storing things that are not different types of things, different qualities. If you're storing like a list of numbers, a list of letters, a list of people, a list of places, a list of other objects and things like that, that would be fine. But objects themselves are good for like an address book, where you want to access things not just based on their order, maybe their index in the array, but you want to access it based on some quality. So this cat would be better represented with the 3 qualities in an object: name, age, and color. So to create an object, you just use curly braces. You have the keys with colons, which reference the values. It's that simple. And here again, we're not using the quotation marks. It's pretty simple, right? Now this should not be confused with function curly braces. They're 2 separate things. Both happen to use curly braces. One major difference, the obvious thing is functions hold pieces of logic, and an object just stores properties. Always remember that your properties are going to be separated by commas. You don't use semicolons in objects. And functions, which also use the curly braces, remember those are separated, different lines are separated by semicolons. This is just normal JavaScript logic. If you want to access a value of an object, you pass in the key like this. It's still a little bit similar to an array, but instead of using the numbers, use the string key. So this is one way of writing it. So this is called bracket notation. If we console log these 4 things, you'll see we get back the values and we get undefined because the thing that we passed in the 4th time is actually not a key in the object. So the answer is undefined. Here's a way of adding a method to the object. So we have here a my method, which is the key of the object, and the value here is actually a function. So if you do this, you can actually invoke the function just like any other function using the parentheses. You can invoke it. So that's how you run a function. You write the function name and then you use the parentheses again to invoke it. And so here we can actually, and I want to point something out here as well. You see how we have the dot notation, dot my method. We haven't, I'm not sure if we've talked yet, you've talked with David yet about this notation, but there's something called dot notation, which is the same as a bracket notation. And I'll show an example of that in 1 second after I'm going to switch screens here. I'm going to open up let's see, open up my editor. All right, so you should see have an editor open here. So if we have an object here, just a quick question. How much has David talked to you? Have you guys learned about the difference between the different keywords, const, let, and var for defining variables? Is anyone gonna answer me?
I'm not sure if we actually discussed that, to be honest. If we did, it's been a while.
Oh, okay. Just to be clear, thank you. Just to be clear, because in that slide we were using var. Var is actually deprecated. We don't really use var anymore. So if I had a variable called this, you see this sometimes, usually in documentation, things online, but we don't use var. What we do use is we use let or const, and I could create an object with either one. Let's see, object 1, object 2. I could actually do the same thing, but typically we will use const with objects. Now the difference is with let, you can, if you're working with a string, for example, let's say I have a string here. So I could then do string equals something else. If I did that with const, let's say we just, and I can actually do here is I can run this code. So I'm gonna console log my string. So my console here in my setup, so I've got, it says something else. If I did const, I tried to run it, I get a type error. A type error is a problem that you have when you have a problem with the type. And here there happens to be a rule in JavaScript that you can't reassign a constant variable. So I can't do that. So in a case where you want to reassign a value, you always use let. If you're not going to reassign the value, use const. The difference with objects, it's a little bit of a nuance here. So let's first of all talk about, and pretend like my favorite color is blue. I think it's still blue. So let's say we console log the object. You can see that's what's happening. That's great. So, but let's say I want to change a property. So with an object, you can change the property. we look at this, so the properties changed. And now even though if it's a const, so this is, we might think this is going to break, it's not. So it didn't break. So the reason is because objects, we're going to see objects, arrays, and functions actually are all something called pass by reference. And that means that this, when I'm changing a property on this, I'm actually not changing the object. Like think of this as like a package. And I'm changing the contents of the package, but the package itself, these curly braces, are still there. So it's like a box. I'm not replacing it with a new box. I'm just replacing the contents of the box. So that's why I can use, and with objects and arrays, typically we use const, unless we know that for some reason we would have to do this. Now this we couldn't do. We couldn't overwrite the whole object with const. So again, we have a type error. We couldn't do that, but we can change the contents of the object. So that's just something I wanted to point out there. Now, if you create an object, now I'll talk about this notation here. So we talked about bracket notation. So if you want to change or say for it change the key here, I could do like this. I could change the name. So the name got changed. I could also do something like this. This is called dot notation. I'm also accessing the value. So now we have Sally as the name. And so that's how you could set the value based using the key. You use a string inside the brackets, or you can use dot notation. If you want to get a name, you can also do the same thing. You could do that. Let's say we just console log my name. Oops, forgot the one there. So we get Sally, and we could also use the dot notation. Sally. This will not work though. Be very careful about this, like everyone pay attention. This is not going to work. Anyone know why this is not going to work? Why we get a reference error? Oh, and I just saw your question, Andrew. I'll answer that in a second. So the answer is that this is actually, if you write it like this is actually a variable. It's actually looking for a variable, let's say. It's actually looking for this name variable. If you write it like this is now a string, and it's referencing the string property of this object. If you pass in a name though, now you could do this. You could pass in name, going to get undefined, because what happens is whenever you put something inside brackets, or if you put a variable inside brackets, or really in any situation, it's going to evaluate to what the value it's holding. So let's say we put this here. So what is this going to happen? This is going to evaluate to this, because a variable is just holding a value. And the variable here is a string with name. So it actually turns into that. So this is actually a common thing. Sometimes you want to access an object, but it's the specific key that you're trying to access is a variable, and it's going to be dependent on certain things. So there you go. Any questions on that? So the console I'm using, this is actually in Visual Studio Code. It's probably the most popular code editor for developers. And there's an extension here called, we can see here, Code Runner. So for example, you could install this extension in Visual Studio Code, and it's just a simple extension that's designed to let you, I hit a key in my keyboard and it runs it as if it was like in a console, like a browser environment. So JavaScript typically runs in a browser. It was designed for the internet and the browser. So typically you have to run either in the browser or an environment which is designed to simulate the browser, like Chrome. So you can do that with CodePen, or some of these other online interfaces, Replit. These are all designed to imitate the browser if you're testing JavaScript code. But another good example of that would be this extension in Visual Studio Code. Another example would be Node itself. Node is the backend server environment that we actually teach at Full Stack, which is basically using JavaScript as a server-side language. And so that is a whole JavaScript environment itself. And so you could actually also, if I wanted to run, let me switch over to a terminal here. So if I actually open up Node itself, Node is a whole JavaScript environment itself. So I can do, it's in this interface is actually a command line interface. But if you run a Node application, you don't run it like this. You actually would run it as like a scripting language. So I just wanted to show you though that there are different environments. Oh, I don't even remember how to. Oh, here we go. Dot exit. Okay. It's not, this console is not something that developers typically use, this Node terminal, but what they use is they use Node as an application and they run software that way. So let me see, I think that's probably good for the information here. I think the workshop is ready to go and I'm going to put people in breakout rooms. And yep, happy to answer any other questions today about any of this material, anything else JavaScript related. Will we meet back here? I'll pull you back. Yeah, I'll pull you back before the end of class to review things. But if you have any questions, just let me know and I'll pop into your room. But yeah, we will meet back here. So if we plan to meet back here, maybe the last 30 minutes of class or so. All right, sure, yep, the rooms are open and I'll see you guys soon.